Good afternoon, everybody. This is a video that is going to review part of Unit 2 about classical civilizations, and this time period lasts from about 600 BCE to about 600 CE, so that's about 1200 years total that this period covers. So let's begin. We're going to start by going over what the civilizations are. You have Persian civilization, based in Persia in the Middle East, Greek civilization, based in the Mediterranean, in Europe, and eventually this spawns Hellenistic civilization, which is when Greek civilization expands its cultural influence, but not necessarily its political power into the Middle East as well, by taking over the old Persian Empire. Then you have Roman civilization, which is going to be very heavily based on Greek civilization, and kind of draw in influences from that. Then you have Chinese civilization and Indian civilization. So we're going to look at some maps that illustrate the development of political states and when these civilizations really reach their peaks of power and territorial control and so on. So, by the 500s BCE, all of the old ancient empires are gone. So the Babylonian Empire is gone, the Assyrian Empire is gone, the Shang dynasty in China is gone. And you see this new wave of civilizations emerging that, based on further development of agricultural techniques and further development of trade routes that bring different parts of the world together, you start to see bigger food supplies and much greater populations than ever before. And as a result, the empires, based on control of these really effective agricultural territories, become larger than any other empires in history up to this point. So, toward the beginning of this time period, the civilization that was really dominant in Afro-Eurasia was the Persian Empire. Persia is now in modern-day Iran, in the Middle East right there, and the dynasty that ruled this empire were called the Achaemenids. And this empire, after they expanded, they took over older civilizations like Egypt along the Nile River, Mesopotamia along the Tigris and Euphrates, they conquered that, and all the way up to the Indus River Valley and elsewhere in Central Asia. So this group of people is incredibly powerful, and for a couple of hundred years this empire remained very strong, very centralized, and very diverse as well. On the edge of Persian civilization, you had the Greek city-states. And remember, these began as independent city-states that were not connected to each other politically, but they did share some cultural elements. In India, you have a variety of small kingdoms and states, and remember, India, this is where you have the caste system, and generally loyalty to one's caste, one's social group, and the rules and expectations based on your social group, generally overshadowed political systems. And even though there will be kings and rulers and emperors at some points in Indian history, generally people felt more loyalty to their social group than to an empire or a kingdom. And then, all the way out in China, in East Asia, at this point the Zhou dynasty was basically gone, and China was in the midst of the Warring States era, when you have all of these small Chinese kingdoms vying for power, and eventually, a couple hundred years down the road, China will be reunified. So, 500 BCE, the Persian Empire is the only major political state that is really of that size. So, let's continue. By 300, a couple of hundred years later, the Persian Empire, after undergoing a couple of civil wars and then getting conquered by the king of Macedonia, a small Greek kingdom named Alexander, he conquered the Persian Empire, and then you have Greeks who rule over most of the Middle East. And, the different dynasties of Greek rulers will rule for different periods of time, but for a couple of hundred years, this is known as the Hellenistic era, where Greek culture and language and philosophy and science and math and building styles become very influential among elites and sort of upper-level people in places like Egypt and the Middle East and Persia. So, Hellenistic kingdoms is when Greek culture is very influential on the kingdoms of the Middle East. Now in India, for a brief time around 300s BCE, you do have an empire that creates a central unified state over most of India, called the Mauryan Empire. And this is going to be the brief moment when Buddhism becomes somewhat influential in India, especially under the one particular king, Ashoka the Great, of the Mauryan Empire. But the Mauryan Empire does not really last too long after this. Now, on the edges of Afro-Eurasia, though, in China, the Qin dynasty, which began in the western part of China, among the warring states, they are going to begin expanding, but there's still a long way to go before they finally absorb all of China into their territorial control. And out in the west, Rome has kind of emerged. And by the 300s, the Romans, people from the city of Rome, whose government was a republic based on voting and electing officials and so on, that republic began to expand and take over parts of Italy, but still a long way to go before it reaches its final peak of power. So, continuing along. By 50 BCE, the Roman Republic has grown immensely. They've taken over much of North Africa, they've taken over Spain, Gaul, which is modern-day France, they've conquered Greece itself, and all the Greek cities are brought under Roman control, and part of the Middle East. So, then in Persia, a new Persian dynasty has emerged, called the Parthians. But remember, they just kind of reconstituted the Achaemenid Empire and ruled it in very much the same way that the Achaemenids had ruled theirs. So, by this time, though, India is broken up again, is disunified again among a number of smaller kingdoms. And in China, the Qin dynasty only lasted a couple of decades back in the 200s BCE. And the Han dynasty replaced them and ruled for a significantly longer period of time, from about 200 BCE to about 200 CE. And the Han dynasty controlled all of the major agricultural zones of China. So, the wheat-growing areas in the north and the rice-growing areas in the south, as well as this territory to the west along the Silk Road, a major trade route that connected China with nomadic peoples of Central Asia. So, now, let's continue. By 100 CE, the Roman Empire has reached its peak. And now by this point, it's no longer a republic. Instead, you have emperors, starting with Augustus, who established, I guess you could say, individual, royal control over the government of the Roman system. And essentially, Augustus ruled as a military dictator, and later emperors would always have the backing of the military as the sort of base of their power. Now, the Roman Empire, though, it expanded a little bit more beyond what the Republic had done. So they went into Britain, they conquered Egypt, and this territory here, which is called the Levant, but it includes modern-day Israel, Syria, Lebanon, the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. And of course, that's where Judaism was based and where Christianity eventually emerged as well. So, Persia, the Parthian Empire, is still there. India, still disunified in the 100s. And the Han Dynasty, still there, still going strong in the 100s CE. But there are some threats on the horizon. So the Xiongnu, this was a nomadic group from what's now modern-day Mongolia, which eventually will be the group that starts invading parts of northern China as the Han Dynasty is collapsing and helps to sort of bring them down. So, let's continue. So, by 500, though, things have changed a lot. In the east, the Han Dynasty are gone, and China is broken up again into smaller kingdoms with different, warlords and people vying for power and claiming authority across China. And this is partly due to internal reasons, partly due to the Xiongnu invading from the north. In India, you have a pretty big dynasty emerge in northern India called the Gupta, who tried to model themselves after the Maurya, but still they were unable to really ever expand to take over all of India. And once again, this is kind of the story of the political history of India. Very disunified, as this different sort of religious and social groups that gave people their identity were much more important for people in that part of the world. the Middle East, the Parthian dynasty has been replaced by the Sassanid dynasty of Persia. And this is really the last great Persian empire that is going to exist, where you have Zoroastrian religion as the basis for the Persian dynasty, religious claims to rule. And then in the West, though, the Roman Empire has split, and Western Europe was invaded and mostly conquered by Germanic peoples. And Germanic peoples came from northern Europe, right about here, an area that had never been part of the Roman Empire. And as civil wars and internal crises rocked the Roman Empire, Germanic peoples invaded the West and started carving out their own little kingdoms that were not really based on like centralized, bureaucratic rule like the Romans had been. Instead, you have more sort of tribal type of governments, where you have war chiefs and warlords who sometimes try to create legal systems like the Romans had. But for basically the rest of European history, these territories of Western Europe are never really unified under one central political system. Now, Constantine, who ruled the Roman Empire in the early 300s, he took the step of moving the capital from Rome, right here, to a city called Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople after himself, because you can do that when you're the emperor. And then as Western Europe was carved up by these new peoples who ruled over these areas, the eastern part of the empire, which was home to these old, wealthier, just very large and densely populated civilizations like Greece and Egypt, this became the new home of Roman civilization. So, by the 500s, once the city of Rome has been taken over by Germanic invaders, historians looking backward call the eastern part of the empire, right here, the Byzantine Empire, named after the original name of its capital city. But at the time, people in this empire still called themselves the Roman Empire, because as far as they were concerned, Rome was the civilization, not just the city. And they would have hoped, that they could bring back control over Rome, but they kept on just being Romans and doing Roman-style government for hundreds more years afterward. So, that is a brief rundown of all of the political systems in the classical civilizations that you need to be aware of, and the political situations. And you can see all of these different colors and kingdoms and peoples around sort of the edges of these civilizations. But we focused on the bigger empires because that's where you had the largest populations, and therefore simply just more of humanity living within those areas than on the outer areas. Now, those other places, we will sort of fill in the spaces on the map as we go along in this class and learn more about them. But for now, we're focusing on the big classical civilizations. So, I will see you next time.